Okay. I see the number growing substantially. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Oh, I just realized I'm not looking at the camera. Welcome. It's over here. We have a great session for you today. It's been a while since I've been on one of these, so bear with me. I haven't done this in a while, but I'm excited to be here. I'm Amanda. I'm your host of today's webinar, How to Prepare for the Next Third-Party Attack. We don't want any of those, right? But we need to prepare. And we have Dave Shackleford, founder of Voodoo Security, on this great session here, and he will walk us through all this information. And also we have our very own Scott Lang here at Prevalent, the VP of Product Marketing, a wizard in this space, in my opinion. He'll just chat towards the end of the session all about how we tie it all together, really. So definitely stay tuned for that. Let's see, a couple housekeeping things, guys. We can't hear you. We have you muted and we don't see you. Hopefully you're all real and you're participating. Use the Q&A. We want to hear your questions. Use the chat. Chat with us, why not? But don't distract us too much because let me get a little confused. What else? Let me do this poll question while we're waiting. Launch it. See, it's been so long that I don't even know what I'm doing anymore. Sorry, guys. While you're waiting, why are you with us today? Please let me know. Education, you have a project going on, you don't know where you are, maybe you'll learn something, and you're a current Prevalent customer. And if you are, welcome back. Hello, pleasure to see you. So we'll keep that up for a little bit longer. Questions are going to be towards the end. We're recording this, so you'll get in your inbox as early as today, especially since you guys are here. So you'll have a lucky little thing to share with other people. I think that's about it, everybody, right? I think we're ready to go. I'll throw this poll question down and I'm going to let Dave take it away. We're very excited to have you, Dave. Thanks for joining us again.
Hey, thanks so much for allowing me to come hang out and talk about the varied elements of third-party risk, but particularly focusing on preparation for the next third-party attack. And so again, thanks everybody for joining today. Really excited to be here because I think we all know this is a topic that needs discussion. In fact, this is a topic that I know I've been having a lot more conversations about progressively with clients over the last year and a half, maybe even 2.5 years, just because, look, let's face it. I mean, the third-party attack situation is not a new one. I mean, this has been going on for years and years. In fact, there's lots of relevant examples out there. In fact, I could probably fill up this entire webinar with nothing but examples and sort of break those down. And I'll give some relevant points along the way as we go. But truthfully, as well as I do, and as well as everyone does, this has been happening out in the landscape for quite some time. We've seen this movie before. A lot of times the movie has a pretty crummy ending. And so in order to sort of mitigate that ending and maybe, prepare for a happier ending as far as these movies are going, to keep using that, look, there's a lot of things we can do. We've got a lot of lessons learned. There's a lot of different things that organizations have come to the realization of relevant to third parties and sort of how to go about this. So we're seeing the numbers grow. I mean, really, maybe that's sort of the statement of the day, as it were, because organizations are sort of locking the front door better than they ever have been. Truthfully, it's not all doom and gloom on this webcast, I promise. As a professional penetration tester, somebody that tries to break in to organizations all over the place, what I've progressively seen, over probably the past decade at least, is that sort of periphery of our infrastructure. So the things that are sitting out in our DMZ, the sort of web-facing or internet-facing properties and assets, those are getting locked down more effectively. Doesn't mean perfect. We all know that that's not possible, but we're certainly seeing some emphasis there. So the attackers aren't coming in through the front door anymore, but what they're finding is that there's a lot of side doors into these organizations, right? Sometimes it's through attacks against the end users. I think end users collectively are sort of the sort of first line of defense and have to be these days, just because so much has gone on there. But more and more, we're seeing the third party avenue, and that third party avenue is really something that's proven effective for a lot of the attackers out there for a broad variety of reasons. And I'll sort of hit on some of those as we go along too, because I think what we're finding is that there's not one answer to this, and there's not one driver in the attacker landscape that's sort of pushing things in that direction. Sometimes, well, the third party might just be the easier, participant in the attack chain to start off with. The other case might be, hey, maybe there's sensitive data in the third party. I don't even have to bother with your environment. I can just go over there and probably get at least some of what I need, if not all of what I need or what I'm after as an attacker. So like we could go down a list of sort of drivers and rationale as to why those third-party attacks are increasing. But the fact of the matter is we're not going to solve that problem here today. What we can acknowledge is that it is in fact happening, and it's incumbent upon us as the end organizations that are involved somehow in some way to prepare and try to get ourselves ready for when these types of scenarios inevitably occur. So you sort of ask the question, what do we need to do? I would assume, probably correctly, that most, if not all of you, have some sort of incident response in place, right? You've got some sort of procedural elements to this. You've probably got some controls and tools. Hopefully you've got some training. You've got a plan, right? If things go bad, and a long time ago, we came to the realization that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. This stuff's going to happen. Now, how it's going to happen, how bad it's going to be, all up in the air, right? We're not going to go necessarily down that rabbit hole. But something's going to happen. So you've got something, hopefully, ready to go when that does. So, oh my gosh, X, Y, or Z is occurring. Kick off the plan. Let's follow the steps. Let's rally the troops, all those things. The question for us today is, what do we need to do in those procedures, in those controls, in those definitions, in those plans, differently, uniquely, or perhaps just with a twist, to adapt for the third-party scenarios? And so what I've done is sort of thought through, right? I sort of, sat around for a bit and said, I'm going to do this webcast. Like, where do I want to go with this? What are the different types of attacks that we would potentially want to discuss here? And there's a long list. I mean, again, we could talk about just examples of potential incident types for probably hours and hours and hours. And there are variations upon variations. Much has been said about this in the industry, and this is really the topic of conversation on sort of a day-to-day basis internally. But if I look at this and say, all right, where would the big problems be? What would maybe the low-hanging fruit look like? What are the big topics that we might want to address or at least discuss here? I'd say failures, right? Failures or outages. That's absolutely an incident type. And the more we're using third-party services that we're interconnecting to and through, say take something like a Microsoft 365 as a great example. That is a third party, and it's an increasingly important one for email or for file sharing or for collaboration services, all the above. If they completely go down, that's a problem, right? So yes, that is an incident, but that's a little different incident. That's an incident related, perhaps to the provider just having some sort of a resiliency challenge, but nonetheless, that's a failure type. And I think it's worthy of mention. It's not necessarily the one that we're, going to drive to here, because I think we would all recognize that's probably going to be more focused on things like disaster recovery, continuity planning. What's our failover, or what's our fallback for X, Y, or Z service just not being there. But it is relevant, because if you go to the very bottom of the list where we look at some sort of a malicious scenario, the same thing could occur due to denial of service. And again, not denial of service necessarily to us directly, but indirectly through a third party that we rely on in some way. So sure, availability still in the mix, got to be in the mix. Beyond that, then we're starting to look at some of the more sort of top of mind traditional types of attacks or incidents, which of course could range from, an insider, one of the third parties that we work with, they've got somebody that goes bad and starts doing something, right? Maybe that something is intellectual property theft related to them or us, again, depending on the nature of our business or relationship. We've got malware infections, we've got unauthorized use or access, we've got different types of intrusions. Again, the list goes on and on and on. So we could come up with all sorts of potential opportunities to think through incidents and think through how we would detect and respond to those if they weren't, again, necessarily right there in our house, but they were in our neighbors, and our neighbors are connected to us somehow, right? Those kinds of things really do matter. And I think the more we talk about this and the more we think about this, we'll realize there are, in fact, some relatively straightforward adaptations to the types of traditional incident response plans we've come up with, over time, that we can make. We can make those, adaptations, or maybe, so you sort of have the playbook that says, hey, if we get notified in this way and the incident is over here versus being, right in front of us within our own organization, here's the steps we should take. Here's the types of things that we should be doing to follow up and think through this, right? So I'm going to use the NIST incident handling framework. I would assume, again, probably correctly, that most, maybe all of you are relatively familiar with this. And we've seen this, over the years. And certainly as a SANS instructor, I've taught students this framework. I think we've all relied on this as, if nothing else, something to put up on the board and sort of work from as far as categorical, sort of breakouts and methodologies. But what we're really focused on here are those stages. So you've got the preparation phase, which means, pretty much anytime you're not necessarily right in an incident, you're hopefully in preparation. In fact, arguably you could say that this webcast that you guys are attending right now is part of your preparation. You're learning something, you're talking shop, you're, thinking through these types of challenges. Cool. All right. So preparation. And then you've got the detection and analysis phases. That's actually 2 phases that have been sort of combined in the most recent version. And then you've got 3 phases, again, combined: containment, eradication, and recovery into one sort of mega phase. And that is an iterative phase. And that's a big area to emphasize here, because very often during an incident, speaking as someone who's been, in the trenches a bunch of times, you'll find something, it'll lead you down a path, you'll do investigations, you'll try to figure out what's going on, and you'll realize that you might have, plugged one hole in the dam, but there's 3 others over here that you just didn't see until you get a little further into the incident. And so you'll have to go back and sort of revise and keep revisiting that. And that's okay, right? I think it's the flexibility factor that goes on here in the middle. But ultimately, when you do hopefully eradicate and recover from the incident, you have what's known as post-incident activity, which is the lessons learned, the discussions. What did we do well? What did we not do so well? Where do we go from here? Were we missing controls? Were there, significant gaps in what we're doing? The list is long as to what could be discussed in terms of post-incident activity: patching, updating, maybe revisiting some of the different types of, solutions that we've been relying on. All fair game, but that's, a feedback loop. And that feedback loop brings us back, as you can see with the big arrow here, in terms of preparation, because then we're back in the prep phase, we're going back to the well, and we're hopefully improving our programs to some degree over time. So that's the whole idea, right? We're trying to get better at this as we go. And by being aware and by really taking stock of how we're dealing with things during incidents, before incidents, and then after incidents, we're going to get better at this. And we have gotten better at this. That's the great news. In fact, there's some positive news out there, coming from, some of like the Mandiant reports and even some of the, like the Verizon data breach investigation report. It's not all positive. In fact, it kind of always tends to sound like the sky's falling. And there's a lot of that going on out there, but there are some indicators that we are seeing improvements. For instance, one of the things we've definitively found is that dwell time, or that time that attackers are able to spend before detection within a network, is going down. It's not going drastically down, it's not plummeting, but it is going down. So where, maybe a couple of years ago, the attackers just had, free-for-all, and they could spend months and months without anybody even knowing they were there, maybe not so much anymore. We're paying attention. So I think there is some positive movement, but again, the reality is the attackers aren't sitting by idly. And to the point of this entire webcast, they're coming in through those side channels and those side doors, or they're taking steps to accomplish their goals in completely different ways than they ever have in the past, largely to get around some of those improvements that we've made. Because let's face it, you may have been making definitive improvements in your security program. I would love to hear that all of you feel rock solid about your incident response and detection capabilities and so on. I mean, really, it's great news, but maybe not all of your third parties have. And that brings us into what we're going to be talking about today, because you can prepare, and you can prepare for the things that are going to go wrong across the spectrum of your third parties, because you can't necessarily fix them, right? You can prepare, but what you can do is monitor, you can interact. There are some things you can change within your own cycle of detection, again, all the way progressively through post-incident activity, but you can't create their incident response plans. You can't put controls in place for them. You can't monitor their networks, right? So when we traditionally talk about all these phases in incident handling or an incident response, it's the implication of, hey, this is your job, right? You've got to go make these things happen within the context of your own infrastructure, your own environments. But really, it's everyone's, sort of fending for themselves. This is about you and how you can prepare for things going on with third parties, not necessarily directly to you. So without further ado, let's jump in to the first incident type. And I alluded to this just a minute ago. DDoS is the tried and true technique that we've seen progressively for, well over 20 years. In fact, I'm probably dating myself. In fact, I'm definitely dating myself here. But I remember the first DDoS attacks that ever came out. And these are classic things, right? I mean, really, I remember some of the early stuff. And remember this is all the way back in the late 90s, early 2000s, when the internet was new and shiny. This was the day where you could get extremely rich by creating a website selling dog food online, right? It was wild times, interesting times. But some of the sites and properties that we know today, the Microsoft, Amazon, so forth, eBay, they were already around. They weren't what they are today, but they were already around. And I will never forget this one attack where it was actually a kid in Canada. I mean, really, he was a kid. I think he was 12, 13, 14, something like that, living at home with his parents, and took all of them completely offline from like his parents' basement. And it's being done over like a modem, right? There's a whole long saga that went on. But I think right then we all kind of looked at each other and went, wow, is this what the internet is destined to be? And of course, we all, roll forward 20 years, no, that's not really what the internet has become or what it's destined to be. But it already showed us all the way back then that DDoS attacks were possible. They're possible in different ways today, but they are certainly possible. And we have seen devastating DDoS attacks against significant online presence in the past decade or so. I mean, I'm talking terabyte per second type of traffic volume. That's madness, right? When you start talking about that level of traffic output, it is extraordinarily difficult to sustain an online presence under siege like that. So, okay, what does that mean for us? Again, let's make the assumption here. This isn't our network. This isn't our environment that's coming under siege. It's one of our third parties that's getting attacked. We're in the banking industry and it's a financial partner, or we're, in the logistics industry and it's someone that we rely on for logistics management or something like. Who knows what that looks like? But it's a pivotal part of our infrastructure or something that we heavily rely on regularly. How do we deal with DDoS against somebody else? Well, the preparation side. So let's think about this. And every time, I'm going to go through a couple scenarios here. Let's put ourselves in the conference room with a whiteboard. We're brainstorming. We're doing a tabletop. We're doing a mock-up tabletop. This isn't even a formal tabletop, but this is the what-if scenarios. Truthfully, these are the things I love doing. I found that a lot of security teams really enjoy, sort of just having these brainstorming sessions. None of us get enough time to do them. I'm probably speaking for all of you right now when I say this. I know this. I certainly hear from my clients. There's not a lot of free time to, hey guys, you want to just brainstorm? I mean, you do this over lunch or something maybe, but it's important to do. So, hey, here's the scenario of the day. What do we do if one of our major third parties gets hit by a DDoS attack? What can we do to prepare for that? So, number one, it's a lot of the same things that you would probably do for yourself. So, especially if it's a connected brokering service or if it's something that's interrelated to infrastructure connectivity. All right, well, then we do need to bring bandwidth into the mix. We do need to make sure we have redundancy, all the things that we would normally do for ourselves just to ensure continuity of traffic and services and availability. That's stuff that we should be doing. We'll check those boxes. You should already have that anyway, right? So let's call item number one on this list sort of the Captain Obvious list item. But number two, then of course, we want to make sure we're engaging our upstream providers. So, hey, if we start to see weird stuff coming from here, or if there's a trickle-down effect possible, then let's make sure that there's a notification of that. These are the same things that I would always tell any would-be incident responders. Hey, whatever you're connected to and through, your backbone carriers, your ISPs, you should have a relationship with them anyway, or you should have at least some visibility into things coming from them and what's coming from them that may be unexpected. Hopefully they'll give you a heads up. You should have a means to contact them, all that kind of stuff. So this is, again, the prep phase, just making sure you know what you have and how to connect upstream. Now, number three, I think this is a great exercise to do regularly anyway. And what I tend to find is that even mature organizations that I work with that are really pretty on the ball, kind of have their act together, there's changes all the time, right? So you can't have a static list of your third-party services that are the most critical and expect it to be exactly the same list next year or the year after that. And so on some, regular cadence, I think going back to the well and saying, all right, what do we rely on the most? And by the way, when I say rely on the most, not just in the context of business criticality, that's one element of this. That's maybe the obvious one. It's business criticality in the context of continued availability. There's a big difference because you may do business with a partner or a service that doesn't require continual uptime or availability in terms of what you need from them or how you work with them. So, hey, we do a weekly clearance process for, certain types of trading activity. We don't, if they're not available for one day, it's probably not a big deal to us. Or, hey, we have, standing shipments that go on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis. Again, if their, network is down for 2 days, it's probably not that big of a deal to us unless it's that exact moment when we might be needing that for some type of shipping. It depends. But if you're talking about some sort of, continual, like online capability set that your users require or that you need, then yes, that criticality is there and that availability concern is there. And that's why it's good to just know what they are, have the SLAs, and then ultimately what I call downtime to detect. In other words, what's the period of time that they're unavailable that would warrant or initiate what I'd consider the detection of things are bad, right? What's that, is it 2 minutes? Is it 5 minutes? Is it an hour? If Microsoft 365 goes down, what's the window, right? How soon are you going to start getting help desk calls? All those kinds of things need to be brought up. So building some sort of list around that, that's a great preparation step. And then turning on some of the monitoring and threat intel for DDoS, against yourself, obviously, or third-party providers. There's a lot of ways to get that. I mean, monitoring. So if you're using some sort of a content delivery network, you're plugged in through Akamai or Cloudflare or something like that, you're probably going to have some of this coming your way. But especially against third parties, if you've got a third party over here and they have no direct connectivity to you or with your infrastructure providers, how are you going to know, right? Again, especially if they don't fall directly into that item in number 3, where you're using them constantly and somebody's going to raise that flag and say, hey, we can't talk to company XYZ, right? They're completely down. Or, hey, our services aren't working. So if they're not in that number 3 category, how are you going to find out about this? I think it's worthwhile to investigate those ways to just be alerted or informed. And the worst way to find out about this is, from the news or something like that. That's really not the best way to come across this stuff. So all good preparation steps. But since we're talking DDoS, it's kind of what it is. Now, what I start saying now is, hey, what are you going to ask third parties? And presumably this is just going back to things like your vendor risk controls questionnaires and saying, hey, do we have adequate representation of this potential incident in there, right? What kinds of things are we asking them? And of course, the purpose of your vendor questionnaires and your vendor queries are to ensure that they're mature or that they have some of the right answers, hopefully, to questions about controls, about security. What's their defense model against DDoS? If they're like, oh, we don't know, that answer, right? There should be some thoughts around mitigation of this, even if the answer is, well, we rely on a third party to do it, right? So again, do they use internal services, external services? Now, these days, I tend to find a lot more organizations, certainly maybe all those other than the very largest organizations, tend to rely on some external DDoS prevention tools or services. And you outsource a lot of this stuff, right? There's a really good chance the folks at Akamai are going to be better at this than you, or the folks at Amazon Web Services are going to be better at this than you. Now, and that's, again, me just generally extrapolating, but it's true, right? This is a very difficult thing to ultimately combat, especially at large scale. And so, okay, that's a perfectly acceptable answer, but there should be a model, and that model should have some good answers with regard to the controls and tooling in place to facilitate prevention and detection of this. What types of upstream failures could enable a DDoS? This is for them. So this is going to that sort of third and then fourth party arrangement. In other words, who do your third parties rely on that could ultimately cause them to be taken out of the mix. If their entire infrastructure is within AWS, guess what? A DDoS on AWS could cause them to be completely unavailable. Thus, you've got that sort of extrapolation for DDoS to occur. And what's the communications plan? In other words, how do they get in touch with you? Do they get in touch with you? When do they get in touch with you? All things that should be covered. Other things that you can do, of course, when we sort of shift into those latter phases of the traditional model, in detection and analysis, what are the indicators that are going to come into you? It's probably going to be things like end user complaints or help desk calls. Hey, can't get to something, noted downtime or outages that might be coming in. Maybe even a keyword element that goes along with tickets that have been opened up in the help desk or in your service desk that pertain to those critical services that you chronicled with regard to uptime and requirements for uptime. Now, something that tells you, hey, service X, we've got 17 tickets that came in the last 17 minutes. That's a big problem, right? One ticket a minute, that's not good. We probably have an issue. Then you move into containment, eradication, and recovery. This one's iffy because it really depends on what types of third parties we're talking about. Do you really have a potential backup or alternate service for everything that's within someplace like Microsoft 365? Most of the time, the answer is no. Let's go to the backup email. No, most don't have that. So, it's the kind of thing where depending on the service, right? For example, maybe it's a storage service. Well, just, hold on to everything until they come back up. Not a big deal, right? So containment, eradication, and recovery. If it is some sort of an online scenario, there could be some rerouting or moving to backup or alternate services, but that's very hit or miss depending on the circumstances. Post-incident activity, just, more about discussing what happened. Was the attack telegraphed? Were they given a heads up or indicator that this could have been happening to them that about, right? Could some additional threat intelligence have helped to detect this and know that it was coming? Were there some, detection and response techniques or processes in place? And were they adequate? What were the impacts of this? These are all good things to think about and to have discussions around when you're dealing with any DDoS, but certainly a DDoS that causes financial impact. You should really be drilling into this and saying, did we do enough? And did our third parties do enough? And what should we do to try to prevent this from happening next time? Okay, on to incident number 2, everybody's favorite. You guys knew you weren't going to be getting out of this session without a ransomware mention, right? Come on, it's the gift that keeps on giving. But again, the news is not all bad. We are starting to do some takedowns. The Rebel folks just I'm assuming at least some of these folks are probably going to jail, and they've been taken out offline. So some of these campaigns, some of these really nasty third-party ransomware groups are being tracked down. So I am bullish that we're going to get better at handling this stuff. But for the foreseeable future, we're still going to be plagued by this, and then that means everybody. I mean, it is really still a huge problem. What can we do about this? I mean, I know all of your organizations directly have probably been talking about this stuff yourselves. Well, what can you do with regard to the third parties? Preparing for ransomware, to me, it's all about the data and the connectivity, right? That's really the two major themes that you need to be bringing to the forefront when you're trying to prepare for ransomware impacts that could be coming from a third party. What data of yours is there? What do they have of yours? Or what access do they have to yours? Are they connected to you? Because if you've got a direct connection to a third party and they have a major ransomware outbreak, it could come right over the pipe, and there you go. I think enabling immutable and offline backups is a great idea for everybody. I think having mature endpoint detection tools is, common sense today. You really shouldn't be relying on, ancient, not so effective third-party, endpoint security. We know this today. Get the best stuff you can possibly get that your budget allows for, because you need that, and have a communications plan, especially one that involves your legal teams and your executives, because this is a business-changing scenario if you get absolutely walloped with ransomware. You could be dead in the water. You got to negotiate or not, right? You have a lot of things that have to be brought up, and a lot of your various stakeholders are going to need to be involved. But again, going back to the third-party aspect, where's your data? It's a good thing to know anyway. And who's connected to you that could potentially impact you in this way? Same thing. Let's talk about the third-party questions. We're talking about ransomware attacks. And by the way, if you're not talking to your critical vendors and third parties about ransomware, and they're not coming to talk to you, that's a missed opportunity. This stuff is happening, and it's happening indiscriminately to just about everybody. Everybody needs to be talking about this and making sure that, number one, we're prepared, but that our third parties aren't going to end up as collateral damage in the case that something goes bad. So again, let's have these discussions. What's our backup and data recovery strategy? What's theirs, the third parties? Do they have patching? Do they have config management for their systems? In other words, how do the attackers get in and actually knock this stuff out? Sometimes it's through a missing patch, or it's through a weak configuration. Do they have endpoint detection and response? Again, good third-party endpoint security that's ransomware savvy. It's looking for those behavioral elements. Look, rapid fire encryption operations are detectable, and they're unusual. So on a traditional file share, I should not be seeing encryption just happening. No, that's not typical, especially for things like endpoint systems. And a lot of the better EDR tools can get that stuff today. So again, do they have something in place for that? If you have data in their environments, you should be asking this one anyway. How are they protecting your data? What's their ransomware notification plan? Do they tell you? If they get whopped by ransomware and it's looking bad, do they notify you and let you know or not? And unfortunately, in a lot of the cases today, the answer is not. They're not going to just reach out and go, yeah, we're dealing with this ransomware. We'll keep you informed. They're not doing that with third parties. In fact, they tend to keep this kind of close to the vest unless they need to, for whatever reason, alert someone. But a lot of times, organizations don't. Other things you can do, obviously, with detection, you're talking about ransomware style behavior coming from third-party networks or systems. The first thing that happens with a lot of ransomware is discovery. A lot of the ransomware out there will look for new victims and look for file shares and look for locations where the data actually resides. Another thing, or different types of scanning or that encryption that I just mentioned. Obviously, some notification, that's bad. If you saw the screenshot that I had at the very beginning, that's an example of Garmin, who got really nasty, a nasty infection. I think it was the middle of 2020. And you think about Garmin, right? So I'm a runner. I've got a Garmin watch myself, and sure enough, like all the Garmin online services were out of commission for a while. But what a lot of people weren't thinking about, Garmin is a logistics company, right? They power logistics, and like traffic mapping and things like that. So people that are doing long haul trucking. All sorts of logistics and transportation industries were really, impacted because Garmin was wholly unavailable for a while. So it wasn't just, people not being able to track their runs with their watches. Although I think I complained just because I didn't know what was going on for a minute there. I was like, what's happening here? But later on when I found out how bad it was, just shows you, right? That kind of stuff can really cause problems. So yeah, you find out about this. In terms of containment and eradication, shutting off network segments or initiating backups or recovery processes, blocking certain third parties. So do you have a conduit that needs to come down? And then asking for updates from your third parties. Did they pay? Have they recovered? At what stage is the recovery, especially if your data is involved? Post-incident activity, did your backups and recovery function? Did EDR or network detection catch this ransomware? Were there communications, and how well did they work? So it's all about going back and saying the things that were in place or that we were told were in place, were they effective? How well did things go from that point on? Right? There's a lot of things that can come out of this. But again, we're all talking about ransomware these days. It's important to make sure that your critical third parties are doing their part to ensure that they're defended as well as possible, but that they're handling this responsibly when things go badly. Now, incident number 3 is tricky because fraud activity can take a lot of forms, and fraud activity can be subtle. It's brand management. It's setting up fraudulent websites. It's potentially trying to do things like site hijacking or DNS hijacks. There's just all sorts of different varieties of fraud. And again, in this sort of third party, fourth party, fifth party ecosystem that we're all a part of now, this one, it may be the toughest, I think, to really ferret out effectively across the landscape of all of your third parties, because look, we don't have enough time, right? I mean, if I've got, let's say 10 critical third parties that I really heavily rely on, and we're all in this thing tied together, right? We're sort of joined at the hip in terms of business processes and practices. If one of them has definitive brand impact, that could trickle to me. That could impact me in some way. Like there's a lot of things that could sort of trickle down as a result of fraud, but fraud relies on broad monitoring. It really does. It requires an enormous sort of visibility into online activity and other things of that nature. And it's hard enough to just manage that for yourself, let alone all of these other affiliates and third parties that you're working with. And so when you're thinking about fraud activity, it's saying, okay, who are the third parties where, again, fraud could potentially impact you? That's a tabletop exercise in its own right? If company X that we do a lot of business with is really impacted by fraud, right? They've got an impersonator online, they've got a website squatter or something that's doing something nasty. What would that do to us, and how could we potentially think through this? Using tools like passive DNS or other third-party risk management or intelligence services to basically try to broaden that scope, find out what's going on out there. So we do business with abc.com. Have there been a lot of interesting activities online around abd.com or around @bc.com because people are trying to create impersonation sites? Those are really interesting things to look for, but it takes time, right? Looking at third-party interactions, anomaly detection. Are we seeing unusual behaviors that aren't traditional for the interactions with our third parties? Again, big order to sort of tackle, because it relies on a lot of introspection and monitoring and making sure that we have our legal teams or maybe potentially even a dedicated fraud team involved in these discussions around third-party fraud activity. Same thing on the third parties, how are they monitoring for brand abuse? Are they collecting threat intelligence related to fraudulent activity? Are they looking at things like DNS? Are they looking for site impersonators or unusual interactions with their own sites? Do they do reputation monitoring to make sure that their reputation isn't being impugned somehow that they're unaware of, maybe in a different region that they're not focusing on, but somebody else over in that region is? This actually happens very, very frequently with a lot of different brands where, maybe they're based out of North America, but over in the Asia Pacific region, there's a bunch of fraud stuff going on that they're not even aware of, right? Or that, potentially going on in South America. They might be finding some things in those different regions. So, getting that broader visibility is a good idea. It's good to ask them how they're addressing that. And then in terms of the other stages, detection, looking for weird web traffic or user traffic, looking for third-party notifications of fraud activity. It's more about that communication path and channel to say, hey, we're dealing with some of this. If you start getting some queries that look like they're from us, make sure you're looking at the email addresses, because we've seen this new site pop up. It's not abc.com, it's abd.com. And so if you look for that in your own email logs and things, we're seeing some attacks against partners. That kind of stuff is really invaluable. Moving into containment, eradication, and recovery, shutting down sites, blocking traffic, legal takedowns. There's a whole field out there in the legal industry for doing formal takedown requests from the ISPs and the web hosting providers, presumably if they're not in some sort of shady part of the internet that listens and takes action on this. And then doing reputation monitoring for brand and image. Post-incident activity, looking at root causes, in other words, what happened? Did we forget to update our DNS registration? What could have gone on? And then same thing, what kind of brand or financial damage occurred? So fraud, definitely a big topic, and one that is definitely tough to tackle for everybody. Now, the final one I'll bring in, of course, is pertaining to software or an internal compromise. I mean, SolarWinds is the gift that keeps on giving, because it was just that bad and it was just that widespread. And it's not exaggerative to say it's likely the worst software supply chain breach we've ever seen. Really, we've had some, certainly not the first, but wow, this one was bad. And I think the positive of this, so there's no great things to say. I mean, SolarWinds, it's just a bad thing all around. But it made us all aware, right? We're all thinking about this now. I'm looking at my supply chain. I'm looking at the software that's running in the environment, and I'm thinking to myself, all right, what does this mean for me? What is the security of the software I am bringing into my organization? And what is the ability of these developers, like the SolarWinds development team, to remediate issues? How fast can they act? What are they doing to address these things? Are we getting gold images from manufacturers that are vetted? And can we test these in an isolated environment? I mean, this is all good prep thinking. But in particular, when you start talking about software supply chain breaches, it's just tough to do. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be asking pertinent questions, right? Are they using open source? The answer, by the way, is yes. I can go ahead and solve that one for you with just about anybody. Everybody uses open source, whether they're really even aware of it or admitting it or not. It's all over. But we've got a lot of vulnerabilities out there, and the more you know, the better. Do they vet the software that they're using? So this goes beyond just, you're using SolarWinds, we're talking to SolarWinds. Are your other third parties using SolarWinds? Because that could impact you. Are they doing behavioral monitoring for software that has privileges? So I think that privilege factor is important. SolarWinds had a lot of privileges. It could talk to lots of things in the environment. And that means that, again, those types of attacks could be even more widespread. So back to the, sort of things we can do. Detection and analysis, we're looking for third parties or news, notifications. That's the worst way to find out, but sometimes it is. Vulnerabilities that are announced in open source packages or libraries that we happen to know are in use, if we know they're in use, looking for things that are unusual, that behavior anomaly of, hey, this is not what SolarWinds usually does, or what have you. This is, again, going not only to us, but also hopefully for the third parties you're working with. In terms of containment and eradication and recovery, what's the patch cycle? How can we quarantine? Can we even quarantine? How widespread is this? Can we block access to software packages or software repositories? Let's say, for instance, we're alerted that version XYZ of the software is bad. We're not at that version yet, but we've got some automated updates. Block that stuff, right? Prevent it from happening so that you don't inadvertently bring it into your house. And then, of course, trace back that software supply chain as much as possible. So in sort of moving towards wrapping up my part of this session, look, review your third parties. It does come back to the prep phases, talking to procurement teams, making sure you're going through those vendor reviews, you've got contract terms defined. And if you find that a vendor product or a third-party solution that you're working with, does in fact have a breach related to it or a vulnerability, what can you do about that, right? How often are you doing those vendor reviews? These kinds of things are important to do, but especially in light of these, sort of third-party incidents affecting you, think through that. Is our questionnaire good enough? Are we getting the information that we need? Make sure you're looking at the controls that they're telling you about, ideally, right? What controls do they have that they'll, talk to you about? Do they do security reviews, and do we align that with our risk reviews internally? And I would say this also goes back to reputation analysis too. If you may not know everything about a third party, but it may affect somebody else, and that sort of bubbles up in the reputational sphere to where, we didn't hear anything about company X, but apparently something's been going on over there because, again, you get some notification sort of through the ecosystem of reputation analysis and third-party analysis that's going on. And make sure that there's a remediation process. If something does happen, what does that look like? So, maybe my sort of way to finish this up, think through this. I mean, if you haven't spent the time to go through and say, all right, are we really thinking about incident management in this regard, right? If we haven't really thought through how to handle incidents in other places and with other parties, maybe it's time to start putting out some of those scenarios, maybe over the course of a couple months or even a year. Let's build out some playbooks. Let's build out some definitions for how we address this, because the most salient thing we can do is enhance our preparation phase. And the preparation phase is, anytime you're not in an incident, you're in preparation to some degree, but it's the more you know, and the more you're capable of knowing about your third parties and what's going on with them, because then that facilitates the improvements in detection and ideally everything that comes afterward. And third-party risk management solutions can help with this, right? You can play a strong role in, basically the prep and the detection. And when we're talking third parties, those are absolutely the most critical and the ones that we can have the most impact on. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Scott. Welcome, Scott.
Hey, Dave, thanks so much. And you can flip to the next slide too, if you like. Everything that Dave said there was spot on. The last point on his last slide was thinking about preparation when you're not undergoing a current cyber attack, for example, and then focus on detection as well. Now, what we found, and you've probably found the same thing, is that when we're thinking about preparation and detection, that thought process of continuous assessment comes into mind. How do I continually assure that, my third-party suppliers have the right incident response programs in place themselves so that they can detect their issues perhaps even before they impact, my organization? But one of the downsides to that is that so often those third-party risk assessments are either manual or spreadsheet driven, and they involve you kind of, sending, spreadsheets back and forth, or maybe storing some things on SharePoint. And it doesn't really lend to the concept of immediacy or currency, or having current data on vendor risk practices, information security policies, or response policies in place. And it just creates a lot of confusion in organizations when a lot of people are involved, and you have to have a good, solid, programmatic way to continually assess vendors' incident response plans, so you can then adequately inform your own. Next slide, Dave. And that's kind of at the heart of what we offer in our approach, is to help make third-party risk management, and by that an inclusion of incident response, a smarter process, a more unified process, and a more prescriptive process, by helping you to continually collect data from your third parties, incorporate data from multiple third-party inputs like reputational scans, data breach news, and more, unify it all together into the same risk register so you can prioritize and coordinate your response, and then develop very prescriptive response actions after that in case you discover a particular breach of a particular technology amongst your third parties. So that's kind of like our approach to it. Dave, next slide, please. And that approach is across the entire vendor risk lifecycle. So of course we're kind of talking about when a relationship is in situ, kind of in progress as well, but it doesn't end there. In fact, a lot of risk is introduced in an environment before you even bring that vendor on. So having a good idea of inherent risk, when you get a good picture of the risks the vendor kind of brings into your environment, able to scale that, organize it, prioritize it, and then help kind of right size your forward due diligence, based on what you learn, is the ultimate output. And provides very prescriptive benefits in terms of reducing costs, making onboarding go faster, improving visibility and efficiency, reducing the amount of time, and then ultimately improving assurance that your organization has policies that it can prove to auditors and its executive management to say, hey, we can understand, we can analyze, we can take action on these third-party attacks when they come in across the environment. Next slide, please, Dave. But at the end of the day, a faster, more programmatic process, as I mentioned before, is the ideal approach, right? And we do offer a solution here called the third-party incident response service. What it enables you to do is essentially onboard and manage all of your vendors in one place, utilize a very specific contextual event questionnaire to assess those vendors against what's important to you. Be that their incident response and communication processes, their mean time to detection and recovery processes. And we help you track, score, and manage those risks that come back from that questionnaire. Give you some prescriptive guidance on what to recommend back to that third party to get them to a spot that you're comfortable with in terms of acceptable risk thresholds, and then give you built-in reporting on progress toward those remediations and then specific mitigations that they've taken. And this is all influenced by a lot of continuous inputs from, as I mentioned, reputational monitoring, cybersecurity scans from dark web and credential sites, as well as data breach databases. So you get a much more holistic picture of the risks that those vendors are presenting to your organization. You can manage them in one place, assess them against these incident response frameworks like NIST, and you just get smarter and faster about getting some proactive intelligence so you can respond much more effectively. Next slide, Dave. Just got a couple of examples of the type of reporting that we offer in the prevalent solution, to kind of talk about using the SolarWinds data breach as an example. We reached out to all of our customers and offered a set of free questions free questionnaire, loaded it up in the platform proactively, and then customers could then execute that assessment with their vendors. And then they were able to get this kind of reporting back that kind of showed them, risk overviews, highest commonalities or areas of risk, severities, what types of entities, impact findings, things like that. That's, insight that you probably aren't getting from another area. And it's all really dependent on, knowing who all of your third parties are, having them in one place, and then building those relationship maps based on, for example, deployed technology amongst them. You can figure out data flows and understand, where your concentration risk is primarily. Next slide, please. Honestly, that's all I had to offer for you today as a kind of a corollary onto what Dave talked about. Thanks for listening to me as I gave my little prevalent commercial there. But I think the net of it is, if you want a more programmatic and proactive process, you got to consider, solutions and processes and kind of technologies and how they interact with one another to kind of fulfill all the things that Dave talked about to be, much more proactive in defending against third-party attacks. So that's it for me. Amanda, back to you.
Hi everyone. Thanks so much. And I apologize right away for the background noise. There's like a bark off happening in my backyard. So hopefully you don't hear that. But we did have one question here. And I also have a poll question that I would love to just get in front of everybody. And I'm launching it right now. And we just want to know, once again, because I think people trickled in towards after the first poll question, are you guys looking to augment or establish a third-party risk management program in the coming months? We know a lot of people are working on figuring that out, especially for the new year, figuring out, budgets, if we can have it, within the budget, whatever it is, if the timeline is right, all that. So answer accordingly, because I'm going to be reaching out to you personally myself. So expect something from me. Don't be surprised if I'm in your inbox in a couple of hours from now. So I'll leave that up. And this other question that we did have was, what is typical time frame / effort to onboard existing vendors? And this question happened while you were talking, Scott. So I have to assume it's about us. Yeah. So I'm going to let you take the floor again.
Yeah, great. I mean, it really just kind of depends on the sources of your vendor profile or the sources of data that you're working with. For example, if you have like a procurement system or a some sort of a some definitive vendor system of record, if you will, that has data in it, can you extract that data into the platform? Do you need to upload spreadsheets of vendors if you've got kind of a manual process? So connectors, spreadsheets. And the third method that we utilize is like a centralized intake form. So you can send an email out to a bunch of folks internally in the organization with this, with a link. They can go in there, they can fill out the information that they know about the vendor, and then it automatically populates that entity profile or vendor profile on the system. So it just kind of depends on the approach you're taking, but it shouldn't take you more than a few hours to get a vendor properly onboarded with basic information before you decide what kind of inherent risk assessment or due diligence you need to perform on them.
Well, that's a perfect answer. So I hope everyone has all their questions answered, because that was the only one. So it sounds like David and Scott said it all. I mean, even I can understand how all the things. I was like, this is great. This is like 101, prepare for third-party risk management attacks, but that's
amazing.
That's it from us. Dave, thanks so much for joining us today. We love how you break everything down so easily. It really is a great lesson to be learned here. And all of this will be in your inbox today later. If someone was specifically asking about the slides, just reach out to me. You can always email that info@prevalent.net, or my email is, you can see my name here. It's first initial last name @prevalent.net. I'll make sure to get those for you. But other than that, that is it. Thanks everyone for joining so much. I hope to see you at the next one, and see you later. Bye.